Attribute fam, peace and blessings. This is Derric Rakumor, and in this video, I wanted to give some insight based upon my experience and based upon my understanding of an introduction into Kemetic magical thinking. All right. Before I do that, I wanted to explain what Kemetic Shamanism is, and this will kind of give you a better idea of what, how to go about working with a guide and dealing with Kemetic from a Kemetic perspective. The term shamanism is a Siberian word. I believe it's and basically what this term really means is the indigenous people in that region, what they would do. Anybody who basically acted as an in-between, as a medium, in regards to trying to understand what the spirits are wanting and connecting that with the human world, the physical world, they pretty much, for the most part, they call them a shaman or a shaman. All right. Since that time, the term shamanism has been used generically by anthropologists, anybody for the most part, to describe anyone who is doing something that is alternative in their mindset, alternative from the Western point of view. So anybody who deals with, anybody who is considered an herbalist, who works with spirits and dealing with herbal medicines, who works with spirits and does, performs magical work, spells and whatever. Anybody who does any of that kind of stuff or any of those kind of activities and practices and follows those traditions is basically what, like I said, Western archaeologists and scholars, that's what they prefer, or that's what they refer to as a shaman. All right. The problem with that is that everybody who does that is not considered a shaman. The difference being is that a shaman can be a person who deals with roots. They can be an herbalist. They can be a person or individual who works with spirits and whatever the case may be. They can be all of that, okay? But all of those different professions, all of those different, I guess that's the best way of saying it, but all those different professions and what have you don't necessarily mean that that individual is a shaman, all right? The main difference between a shaman and those individuals is that a shaman basically has their main goal is to act as a medium in regards to establishing balance between the spirits and the human world. Okay. And you compare that to some people who do herbalism and all that kind of stuff. Some of these people who do this, they have selfish reasons for doing it. Some people who work, who do spells, who do magic work for others, they have selfish reasons for doing that. The difference between them and a shaman is that a shaman does not have a selfish reason for doing it. The whole purpose of a shaman doing that is that they are trying to establish a balance. Okay, they're trying to establish a balance in that individual's life between the spirits and the physical world. Okay, the spiritual and the physical world. All right. So when I talk about Kemetic shamanism, I'm approaching it from that same perspective. Presently, there's a lot of people who are around and they're saying, hey, we follow the Kemetic religion and this is the Kemetic religion. I don't follow the Kemetic religion. All right. As I had stated in a previous video, my understanding based upon my ancestors and my guides, the Kemetic people, the religion that is basically being promoted based upon what the archaeologists have found and what have you, that's one snapshot of what the Kemetic people believed in. The Kemetic society, from my understanding and from my perspective, the Kemetic people, they were a cosmopolitan society. It consisted of numerous ethnic groups. So there was numerous spiritual paths. The path that we see, or the religious path that we see that we see a lot of archaeologists are talking about, this is the religion of the people who were in the monarchy, okay? It does not describe those people who were not in, the farmers. It doesn't describe those individuals. As I stated in the previous video, if you want to find out more about all the different ethnic groups, all the different ethnicities that were inside of who were in Kemet, all you do is read Shenkat Diop's African Civilization, or I believe it's African Civilization or African Origins. But read his book. There are several scholars, several historians who have noted that they have found traditional African culture that ties back to Kemet. All right. There's a reason why they're not telling you this. There's a reason why they're not promoting this. And for that reason, because they're not promoting it and because they continue to stay on the same path of this is what the ancient Egyptian religion was and what have you, that's part of the reason why I refer to myself as a Kemetic shaman. All right, because I choose to follow the Kemetic path of Ma'at, but based upon an ancestral perspective, based upon my ancient ancestral perspective. Okay. And in particular, Kongo. All right, Kongo-Angolan. All right. So that being said, the reason why I'm saying that is because when I first came into the whole Kemetic spirituality deal, when I first started reading about Kemetic spirituality, like a lot of people, I read the history, studied the history in and out. All right. Eventually, just like a lot of us have done, eventually when you're reading about the Kemetic history, you eventually come to this fork in the road. And that fork in the road basically is like, well, you start to see that the historians, they're going to be biased. And part of the reason why a lot of these historians are biased is because they are protecting the interest of those individuals who basically supported their research, who gave them money. I mean, there's not a whole lot of money in archaeology, all right? The money in archaeology comes from donors. And so that's the reason why a lot of the donors, a lot of archaeologists and historians, that's why they basically, for the most part, they'll never tell you, oh, well, the Kemetic people, they were black and brown skinned people. They'll never tell you, they'll never come out and say, the Kemetic people, their descendants, they have scattered throughout the continent of Africa, They'll never tell you any of that because it does not support the interest of their donors, all right? So that being said, we need to stop waiting for them to do it, and move on. And stop focusing. And I'm not saying that it's not important to know that the Kemetic people were they're African descendants. I mean, they're people of, black and brown skinned Africans. I'm not saying that's not important, but I'm saying if we reduce our whole idea of learning about Kemet to just the skin complexion, the skin color of these people, if we just do that, then basically the thousands of years, their entire legacy and the mark that they've left on this planet for their descendants and for humanity for that matter to follow in order to get out of the funk that we're all in, it basically, is null and void. There's no point of doing it. Okay. So that's the reason why we have to move on. Okay. Yes, it's great. We understand the Kemetic people were black. Okay. Moving on. All right. Let's go on. All right. Now, that being said, like I said, when I went ahead and I started learning about Kemetic spirituality, I started learning about the history and what have you, and came to that fork in the road. And then that fork in the road, basically, it's like, okay, you realize, all right, these people, the people who are reporting this, they're kind of biased, And so once you go ahead and you reach that fork in the road, and it's like, okay, you recognize that the historians, the reporting of the Kemetic people their history and what have you is biased. Once you come to that conclusion, then it's like, okay, you take that, which way do I go? And for a lot of us, we went down the Afrocentric path. All right. Now, when we go down the Afrocentric path, what happens is that we get involved in the metaphysics. And when we get involved in the metaphysics, because we're going down this path, and this is not to say that you wouldn't get involved in the metaphysics if you took the Eurocentric viewpoint, but I know that the Afrocentric perspective, it is heavily is very, very heavily, influenced by the whole metaphysics. And you get into the metaphysics and you get into the science, and as a result, that's what happens. You get stuck. You don't go anywhere else. And you don't understand the reason why you're stuck is because that's part of the trap of going down or focusing on the whole, the ethnicity of the Kemetic people. All right. Because when you get stuck, then you're not able to do anything else except for, quote, well, the reason why, the whole purpose of the Ankh is it represents the male and the female. You don't go any further than that. You stay focused on that. Oh, well, the Eye of Haru and the Eye of Ra, this is what it deals with, and this is this and this. And like I said, you get stuck in that point. Okay? You don't go any further because you're basing everything that you're basing everything that the Kemetic people dealt with. You're looking at it strictly from that analytical, intellectual perspective, which is the same way that if you had taken, like I said, the Eurocentric view, that's how they started off. And that's the big trap. Okay. Now, I remember when I did that, I was into that, and for the longest time, I remember I was frustrated. It was like, how come this is so freaking confusing? How come I can't, I don't feel like I'm growing. I don't feel like I'm doing anything. And that's when I met my mentor. And it was a funny thing. When I met my mentor, one of the first things he did, he comes over to the house and everything. And I can't remember where I got this from, but I had like a little statue. And in fact, I think I got it from a thrift store. That was a funny thing. So I had this little statue, and he was on the fireplace mantle. And this statue, he was a drummer, all right? And it was so interesting. The first thing Papa does when he comes in, he's looking around and he looked up and he sees this statue. And he takes the statue and he's like, hey, he's like, that's Shango. And I was like, huh? And he was like, yeah, he was like, that's Shango. And he was like, and he should be, and he said, hey, he should be on the floor, And he was like, and after he told me that, he was like, hey, he should be on the floor. He showed me, some simple things, very simple things of what to do. And he was like, hey, you got to offer him a candle, and give him some light. And I remember the first time when he said that, and I thought about it, was like, now the funny thing about it was that statue had been in my possession for, I can't remember how long. I mean, like I said, I got it from the thrift store. But when he told me that, and he started sharing that kind of insight, it gave me a different perspective of what Kemetic spirituality was, even though he's coming and he's talking about it from he's coming from an Afro-Cuban perspective, which is particularly in Lukumi and like I said, Espiritismo, Cruzado. He's coming from that perspective. It was magical thinking, all right? And based upon, like I said, there was a lot of things. It took a long time for me to actually put it together, to figure out what he was actually doing and all that kind of stuff. And like I said, I talked about that before, because I was just really naive. But by the time I end up and I come into the light, and it's starting to make sense, I came to the conclusion. I remember I was like, oh, that's right, and I went back and I visited that whole situation, that whole thing that happened with me and Papa. And I remember I went ahead and I wrote it down, and I revisited that whole situation. And what I did was I got to looking at it, and I was thinking, and when, I'm coming through it, and I'm like, oh, that's right. Everything's energy. And if everything is energy, that means everything basically, yes, it all has a spirit. But the whole reason why we're not able to see it from a metaphysical perspective is because when we focus on the metaphysics, really what we're doing is we're boosting our ego, and we're entertaining our intellect. And the intellect, there's a part when you're dealing with Kemetic spirituality. There's a part with all spirituality, especially African spirituality. Anything dealing with African spirituality and Kemetic spirituality is part of that. There is a point where the intellect, it actually ends, and it's nothing but esoterics that takes over. All right. You won't be able to understand it past the intellect. You have to be able to do it or the only way you can actually understand it, or in this perspective, understand and overstand, is by, you have to use your imagination. You have to go into it from a different perspective. Okay. Now, if you think about, like I said, everything has energy. And from the Kemetic perspective, based upon Kemetic teachings and philosophy, everything comes from the raw. And if everything comes from the raw, it all has energy. And it basically all has a spirit. But what has prevented us from actually seeing past the physical is that we never really had anything that actually says that our reality is set up like that. Okay, so this is the reason why the Ma'ankh comes into my life. The Ma'ankh cosmogram was the diagram that basically, or cosmogram that basically helped me to understand that our world is composed of two lands. We have the Taset, the physical land in which we all dwell in, and we also have the spiritual realm, which is Kamta. All right. Now, when it comes to dealing with spirits for the most part, they exist in Kamta. Because we, the living, are in the physical world, we only see the physical effects of things. So this is the reason why when something happens, we see it, but we don't understand why it happens, because we don't see the spiritual side of it. Okay, we see it as an accident. It's an accident that took place. Well, it's because you didn't see the spirit that was behind the accident. We call it synchronicity. Well, it's because we call it synchronicity because that's from the physical side. But it's because we didn't see all the, the players, the spiritual players that were involved that made that event take place. All right. So when it comes to understanding, and when we come to the understanding that our universe or our world is composed of two realities, we have a spiritual and a physical reality. We dwell in Taset, we dwell in the physical reality. All right. And because we dwell in this reality, we're not able to see beyond it. There's we don't see the spirits, and we don't see all the different influences and what have you that exist in Kamta. Because of that, we're not able to connect. We're not able to move past that whole metaphysical intellectual mindset and actually see and actually start practicing Kemetic spirituality the way our ancestors did, or the way the instructions that our ancestors, our ancient Nilotic ancestors basically set forth, so that we can, get back on this path, get back on our spiritual path, on our spiritual grind. All right. So the recommendations I'm going to make in regards to learning how to start thinking magically, in order to start thinking from a Kemetic perspective, to get off of this whole intellectual thing. And understand what I'm saying when I say this. I am not saying that the intellectual thing is, or metaphysics is wrong, not by any means. But if you understand, when you start understanding and you start really learning what Kemetic spirituality is, and you really start understanding what these different energies, or necharu, whatever you want to call them, when you really start understanding them, and you start looking at the other side of reality, okay? Because right now we're just in a physical reality. We don't see the spiritual reality. Once you get a holistic view, all right, you get that eye repair by Shahudi, like Haru did, and you get that holistic view, then you get to see both realities come together, and you're able to interact a little bit more. You're able to do things more. You're able to say, oh, okay, the reason why I can't do this is because of blockage, because right now, when you're stuck, when you're dealing with that whole, like I said, the metaphysical part, and you're not able to transcend, you're not able to actually practice anything in the real, you're not able to make any kind of manifestations take place, realistically speaking, all right, because of you dealing with the metaphysics. It's because you got blockage, and that blockage is from set. But see, when I say set, you're not going to understand that, because you're still looking at it from, a lot of us are still looking at it from a religious perspective. And that's the reason why you're not getting it. So the suggestions I'm going to make in regards to start seeing things and doing things from a Kemetic magical mindset, okay, or magical thinking, is learn a legend. All right, learn a legend, learn a myth. All right, commit the myth to memory. All right, when you commit this myth to memory, don't analyze it, don't do any of that. Okay, just commit it to memory. All right, my myth of choice, of course, you should know this, is the story of Osir. All right, just to give you a little bit of background, the Kemetic people, the story of Osir was basically the Kemetic people's that was their main Bible. They didn't need a whole bunch of other stories. I mean, they had other stories and all that kind of stuff, but it all tied into one major story, one major legend, which was the Kemetic story of Osir, okay, or Osiris. All right, so that's my myth of choice. All right, now, like I said, it doesn't matter which myth you choose. The whole purpose of you learning the myth and committing the myth to memory is so that you recognize when the spirit is actually talking, or when the spirit guide is actually there. Okay, so like I was saying to you earlier, and this is the reason why I started off this way. When Papa comes to the house and he sees a statue of a drummer, he automatically recognized, well, that's Shango. All right, but here I had this statue in my house for I don't know how long, and I never recognized that's what it was. I never recognized, oh, that was Shango that came into my life. Oh, okay, well, that makes sense. All right, And it wasn't so much, and understand before somebody takes that the wrong way, I'm not saying that it was, he wasn't saying that it was the actual Orisha, the Orisha Shango. He was saying that that was a guide, and that's exactly who it was. And right now, there's a lot of us. We have guides all around us, but because we don't recognize the myth, we don't know the myths, we don't recognize the signs, and we're looking for validation from other people to tell us, oh, this is what's in your life, or this is who's coming to your life. We're looking for validation instead of doing our own research and doing our own study and homework. That's the reason why a lot of us, like I said, we're not able to get past that whole metaphysical, intellectual mindset. Okay, so learn a myth, commit it to memory. Like I said, it doesn't matter which myth you use, because eventually this is the whole thing that Carl, the Swiss psychiatrist, Carl Jung, this is one of the things that he was recognizing. All these myths, they all tie in each other. Okay, they're all archetypes of each other. All right, it's not the same energy, but it will lead you to where you need to go. All right, so learn a myth, commit it to memory. Don't analyze it, don't do any of that, just learn the myth. All right, after you learn a myth, if you have statues or so, all right, start listening. If you have statues that are in your house, you got a picture that's in your house, a photo or what have you. I'm not saying a photo of, people who've, your deceased loved ones or so. I'm talking about, certain inanimate objects, like I said, if you got statues, you might have some animals, you might have like one of those animal, those plaster animals or so. You'll start noticing when you start looking at these things, okay, and you, like I said, familiarize yourself with the myth. You start looking at these things, you'll start to notice the patterns. You'll start to see, for instance, ladybugs might show up. Ladybugs show up they show up in my dreams a lot, You might start to see spiders for some reason. That's one of the animal totems that come to me. Spiders, they'll just, it's like I won't see them or anything, but when they make themselves known, they're like, hey, smack right dab in your face. And you're like, oh, okay, all right. And it's like, hey, I go ahead and I'll let it outside or what have you. But then it'll appear in a dream, Those, then come to find out, that was one of the animal totems that one of my guys was using. Okay, so to get yourself into that whole magical thinking, to start getting into magical thinking, like I said, once you go ahead and you learn a myth, memorize a myth, start looking at those patterns. All right, start looking at those patterns, and once you start looking at those patterns, here's another thing. Once you start looking at those patterns, I want you to take a white candle, and it doesn't have to be a big candle, but take a white candle, a little white candle, it could be like a birthday candle or so, and light it and give it to them and say, hey, I am offering this to you because I recognize you are making your presence known in my life, and I see you. And that's it. Now, of course, let the candle burn in a safe place, not around anything that's combustible, okay? But like I said, just a little small candle, all right? It could be a tea candle, it could be a little birthday candle, all right? But once you go ahead and you start doing that, once you start doing that part right there, you'll start to see some changes. You'll start to see that all of a sudden your guides will speak to you a little bit more. And based upon that, you'll get a better understanding of where you're supposed to go and how to do things from a magical perspective. All right. So hopefully that helped. Like I said, if you have any questions, feel free to drop me a line. Thank you. Heads up.